So just a quick show of hands before signing up for a GOTO this year. How many people had been exposed to the term progressive delivery? Okay, how many people, thank you, like the thumbs up, that's helpful, thank you, Leonard. And then also possibly a slightly large audience, but how many people have been familiarized with the concept of feature flags? Awesome, okay, that's most of you. And how many are actually currently using some form of feature flags in your environment? Great, okay, so that's, I'm gonna guess about half. Perfect, so you're in the right place. Let's jump right in. So I always put this slide up at the beginning of my talks because, and that's why we come to these shows, right? Which is that some teams are already doing some really cool stuff, and you just kind of have to learn that it exists and learn how it works in order to make it possible for yourself. There's a lot of really cool stuff that's already being done. It's just not very even distributed. We don't all get to work in the same environment where all the tools and the toys are readily available either, right? But by the end of this talk, my goal is that you will definitely have some new ideas. If you've never heard of progressive delivery, you're going to get a ton of new information. If you've heard of feature flags, but haven't really seen what happens when you overlay data with the feature flags, you're going to get a huge kind of eye-opener here. And really, the whole talk is designed to enable developers and dev teams to, frankly, have more fun and get more things done in a way that's more empowering and more satisfying. So what is progressive delivery and what are the potential benefits? And I'm going to go through the benefits kind of two different ways. One way is a way that I've actually been doing for almost 2 years now, and then we're going to take a different approach that's really more focused really on developer experience. So Carlos Sanchez, who's now at Adobe, or at least it was last time I checked in on him, came up with a pretty good quote that explains this in a really straightforward line-by-line way. So progressive delivery is the next step after continuous delivery, where new versions are deployed to a subset of users. And that subset's really important, right? We'll see why in a minute. And are evaluated in terms of correctness and performance. And you could see this looks kind of like QA, but not really. This is it doing what we expected it to do? And is it performing? Are there errors? Is it too slow? And correctness doesn't necessarily just is there an error, but it could be, our goal was that people would do more of this if we move this release. If we provided options on sign up for configuring things, more people would configure, whatever, right? And this is done before rolling out to the totality of users. So this is this is the kind of paradigm shift, which is a release is not just a big bang where everybody gets it all at once and you hope everything goes okay. You're actually gradually rolling it out to a subset of users and learning something. And that's before you go all the way. And the last line, and rolled back if not matching some key metrics. And so the idea is that we can actually observe during a gradual rollout, progressive delivery, what's happening, and we can either make tweaks as we're going, or we can actually shut off bits and pieces that aren't really behaving as we want and let the other pieces roll forward. So just a little bit about the origin story. And the reason I do this is kind of, where do these words come from? Progressive delivery, the practices have actually been out there for quite some time, but the term is just about 2 years old. There was a conversation between Sam Guckenheimer, who's now retired, but was with Microsoft, Azure DevOps, Visual Studio stuff before that. And he was having a conversation with James Governor, who goes by the Twitter handle MonkChips. And what Sam said was this: well, when we're rolling out services, what we do is progressive experimentation, because what really matters is the blast radius. How many people will be affected when we roll that service out, and what can we learn from them? And I think the reason why I like this quote is he used the term progressive experimentation, which is gradually experimenting. And he mentioned blast radius, and he mentioned learning, not learning once a year or learning in a retrospective, but learning literally as they're rolling it out to progressively more people, right? And James Governor thought, I've been looking for a term to describe this new basket of skills and technologies that have to do with the way modern teams develop, test, and deploy software. And so he proposed this term, progressive delivery. And initially he was a little anxious about, coining terms. He's like, I'm not in the business of coining terms, but, it stuck. And so I spent the last 2 years kind of talking about these main sort of 4 benefits of progressive delivery, which are to avoid downtime. If you're familiar with the blue-green, and we'll see this in a second, a blue-green deployment model, you could have production running on one set of infrastructure, and you have really a copy of the infrastructure, and you can take as long as you want to get that other copy all set for the new release, and then cut people over all at once. So instead of a maintenance interval where your site is down, you actually can just go from one to the other with no delay. That avoids downtime. Also, the unscheduled downtime is something you want to avoid as well, right? Limit the blast radius. So this is this notion of how can I limit both in time and in scope bad things that happen. So when things break, how can I only break it for a few people? Oh, I apologize. You know what? Your sound's about to get a lot better. I just realized my microphone was sitting on the counter. Better, yes, Pauline? All right, super. Sorry about that, guys. So limit the blast radius, time and scope, right? And then limiting work in process and achieving flow. Most of you are probably somewhere along a continuum of doing a transformation or being in an environment where you're trying to use more modern tools. If you're in a new company, you probably started out that way. If you're in a company that's been around for a while, you're trying to get more to this notion of continuous delivery and flow and moving lots of content, smaller bits of things more often. And how do we facilitate? And then last, learning during the process. So these were the terms I used to describe progressive delivery until very recently. And I made a matrix, which I presented a few times, which sort of looks at the different, remember Monk Chips was talking about a basket of different techniques and skills and whatever. And the main ones are blue-green deployment, canary releasing using containers, feature flags, and then feature flags combined with sort of a data ingest infrastructure, right? And as you can see, those various goals get met better and better as you go to the right here. And really, feature flags, it's not coincident that the term progressive delivery didn't really come, well, it wasn't coined until after feature flags had kind of broken through to the point where everyone knew what they were and started to understand why they were useful. And it was because they controlled not an entire release, they controlled a piece of a release, a bit of code, a feature, some sort of code block that was in your feature that you wanted to roll out. And by actually having the ability to control it at the code block level, at a feature level, it really made a lot of things possible. And that white dot at the bottom of the feature flag column is that feature flags by themselves give you control. Yesterday, one of the questions was, hey, can you recommend any sort of open source frameworks for feature flags? And a lot of people have built their own feature flag systems, but they didn't tackle this last dot, which was how do I make it something that actually captures telemetry and makes sense of it? And the larger players who've been at this for quite a while, like the Microsofts and the Booking.coms, addressed that very early on, and we'll talk about that in some of the examples. So just quickly going to drill in. So everything we're going to talk about today is based on feature flags, and I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Most of you are familiar with them, but a feature flag is really a place in your code where you can control whether users pass through that code or not. And you kind of have like a dial in the cloud where you can turn this up or down. By definition, feature flagging is outside of your code so that you don't have to do a new deployment to change the value of the feature flags, right? To change whether they're on or off or who they're on or off for. And if you look at the first line in this graphic, it's 0% population. And you might say, well, why am I rolling out to 0% of my users? And the reason why is testing in production. I want to be able to get all the way to production, but have the software not executing for any of my users yet so that I can test it in the actual production infrastructure. And the flip side of that, if 0% of my users are being exposed, 0% of my users are potentially harmed if there's something wrong. Okay, so for those of you who like to see a little bit of code, here's a couple examples of what it might look like in code. Essentially, you're making a function call. In this case, it's flags.getTreatment for related posts. And in the real world, you would probably also pass the user context to this. Who is the user and what else do you want to know about the user in that function call, right? And you'd get back either an on or something else. And if related posts came back as on, then you'd show that particular user the related posts, right? Here's an example where you're evaluating two new potential search algorithms in the back end. And so, if it's treatment V1, use V1 of the new algorithm, V2 use the other one, and then otherwise use the existing. And this might be where you're evaluating two new ways of doing the back end searches, right? So that function call, again, gets called in your code, but the answer is dictated by rules that can be changed on the fly from outside your code. Hopefully that's clear way to explain it. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and we're about to get to the part where I explain kind of the new ways that I sort of talk about progressive delivery and how this works. And one of the key concepts here is you can't always believe everything you see. So when you're rolling things out, traditionally what we do is we roll things out and then we watch our graphs and our dashboards and look for alerts and whatever. And if something's really bad, you'll see a big step change in something and like, oh, wow, we just saw a big, huge change in latency or network traffic or CPU consumption or whatever, right? Must be the new release, right? The reality is that a lot of things can be happening while you're pushing software out, and they can also make your graphs move. And if you're pushing software out to only a subset of your users, you're not likely to see vivid signals. You're going to see faint signals, because if you're pushing out to 10% of your users and 2% of them are getting errors, that's a tiny little percentage of getting errors. It's not really going to show up very well, right? So there are better ways to understand how it's going, how your release is going, right? And really, it comes to this, which is using the scientific method, which is using techniques that come out of experimentation. In a double-blind trial, you take two identical populations and you put them through the control and the treatment, control being normal, the status quo, treatment being the new thing, right? And what's beautiful about this is if you're truly randomizing some population and sending them these two different ways, you're canceling out any external influences. And it could even be, external to your company, or it could be external to the code you're testing, right? Like it could be something else in your product that was changed, but you can learn for this feature, if you split people up this way, you can basically detect the signal much better. And these numbers don't have to be 50-50. If you're rolling out to 10% of your population, you can do comparisons of what their experience is to the other 90%. But the key is to use readily available, readily proven scientific techniques for detecting whether things are good or bad. So that's what leads me, and there's a little lag in my slides for some reason, I don't know why. That's what leads me to this new way of talking about progressive delivery, which I'm calling, up-leveling your game, right? So this is a set of things that kind of build on each other. This is going to be a pyramid here. And the first one is to decouple deploy from release. And why we do that is, one of the reasons we do that is to be able to do smaller bits of development and get them all the way out to the customer, or at least to production where I can test them. It's a notion of incremental feature development, which is breaking things into smaller pieces that can be accomplished inside of a sprint, inside of a day, whatever, so that you can get more flow, right? You can actually have more momentum going out to the real world. This also makes testing in production possible, because you can push things to production that aren't being seen by users yet. And most importantly, I think for those of us who are into quality of life issues, is the kill switch. So another quick show of hands, who has been in a war room or a triage situation for an hour or more? Where something was broken and you guys gathered around in a chat room or whatever, and an hour, right? So how about 4 hours? Anybody been stuck in one of those for 4 hours? Right, okay. How about it went beyond a day? So most of us have been in something like that, or we've been around something like that. And with feature flags, what's really cool is that you can literally just stop the pain right away by hitting the big red button and figure out what went wrong later. As opposed to like, oh, how are we going to hotfix this? Or are we going to roll it back? Can we roll it back? Et cetera, right? So building on this foundation, and by the way, that bottom is, if you sort of build your own feature flags, you're using database columns, you're using config files that get pushed to servers using any of these other ways of doing things, you've probably accomplished that bottom level. You get those benefits, right? But where it gets more interesting is if you learn how to automate guardrails, or what we call do no harm metrics, right? In this case, we want to be able to get alerts when we're seeing exception rates or performance issues early in the rollout. And we want to do this automatically. And the second bullet's kind of important here. We want to limit that blast radius, but we want to do it without manual heroics. So being hyper vigilant every time you push a release to make sure that nothing went wrong, right, is exhausting. And if you're going from quarterly releases to monthly releases to weekly releases to daily releases to hourly releases, the reason we do continuous delivery and we automate things is that the things that need to happen every time should just happen, and that humans should only have to intervene when something is unusual, right? So by automating guardrails and do no harm metric checking, you are taking care of that vigilance without a human having to wear themselves out, right? So and that's a guardrail on the right. We can talk about that in QA. You know, a guardrail on a road exists. Why? So you don't drive off a cliff. And when you hit the guardrail, there's a loud bang and it shakes you up, but you know, and you might even get a dent on your car, but you don't fly off the cliff, right? That's what a guardrail is. So building on that foundation, right? Measure, release, impact. Now this is, again, a quality of life thing. So if you're stuck in a situation where you've achieved Agile because you're doing short sprints and you're building software really often, but you don't have measurement. The idea with Agile was I want to be able to get feedback faster, right? I want to be able to try something, get it out to the world, get feedback, iterate, right? And the comparison was, well, if I'm spending 6 months between somebody writing a spec and me getting the stuff out to the customer, I don't get any chance to get feedback from anyone about whether I've done the right thing, and what the customer wants may have changed during the 6 months, right? So the idea with Agile was, well, let's do this much faster, right? And kind of the typical thing is sort of a 2-week cycle, right? Well, iteration without measurement is kind of a feature factory. You're stuck cranking stuff out with no feedback, right? And that, again, is kind of like, instead of feature factory, I was going to call this a hamster wheel. I don't know if that's a term you guys use in Europe, but, you know, sort of going in circles, running really fast, right? So if you have direct evidence of what you've accomplished, it's a much better feedback loop for you just as a professional. And it leads to pride, and it leads to a sense of satisfaction. You can actually see, wow, we actually influenced that. I was working many years ago at Keynote, and we had a new guy come in, and he was helping us re-engineer how our portal worked for our customers. And the day after we pushed a major release, he was counting through statistics and talking about this many people went this way and this many people did that. And I was like, wow, I've never heard this conversation before. No one's ever said, hey, because of what we did, all these people are doing this thing that's different, right? And I was like, oh, duh, that's useful. And I know many of us have lots of metrics, but here again, the idea is, what if I could link the state of my feature flags to other data and know that when people went through that code, this happened, right? And then finally, and this is kind of icing on the cake, and I'm going to talk about this. If you've heard about test to learn or A/B testing, you know, people often will think of this as sort of a growth hacking thing or a marketing thing. And, you know, it is kind of, I consider this frosting on the cake, because the 3 layers below that are accessible and meaningful and life-changing for all development teams, no matter what their role is, no matter what kind of software they're doing. The top here is where you're actually trying to learn things in a bit of a vacuum, or you're not really sure about something. And so what if we could take bigger risks, but in a safe way? What if, instead of like making a massive change to your system and hoping that it's going to go really well, and only finding out whether it's okay or not after we roll it out to everybody, what if we could take big risks in a more safe way? And what if we could learn faster with less investment? So this isn't about building 2 completely separate versions of your code and having to maintain both of them. This is about being clever about how you can use these techniques to learn fast without a lot of cycles, right? So the first thing I'll mention is something called dynamic config. If you're using feature flags to control whether some code is being executed or not, you can also very easily pass along dynamic parameters that would dictate, for instance, if you're returning choices for a customer, should I return 3 choices or 5 choices? And that doesn't require a code change. You could run it for a week with 3 changes and then run it for a week with 5. Or better yet, you could split your population and give half of them 3 choices and half of them 5 choices. And then you could dial it up or down from there without a new deployment, right? And this, I don't know how many people have heard of painted door. Painted door, you may have run into one of these in a product once, which is you're in a user interface typically, and there's a feature, and you're like, wow, that's a new feature, that's interesting. And you click on it, and you get a message like, oh, hey, we're working on this, but we're glad to hear you're interested. A painted door is literally just a door with nothing behind it. And the idea here is, if I put a feature in my product that I think people might like, but I'm not sure, I can put it in as a painted door. And if people go there, you know there's interest. If they don't go there, you know what? Hey, maybe we ought to rethink whether we're going to spend a lot of time on this, right? So this pyramid, again, if you look at the first 3 rungs of this is becoming like a de facto standard. The bottom rung pretty much already is. When I asked you guys how many people are using feature flags, most of you said yes. So you're already doing this thing on the bottom, right? And it's the layers above that which the early pioneers focused on as the kind of holy grail. I need the ability to know how it's going. And these were mostly B2C companies with giant user populations. They couldn't afford to interview people or use full story to look at each session and figure it out, right? let's talk about some of those lessons learned, and then we're going to get into Q&A where we can actually chat about this stuff. So I'm going to start with an example of a big company, which, basically a unicorn, has lots of resources. Previously, when I gave this talk, I used 3 unicorns. I would sort of talk about this unicorn, and then that unicorn, and then the other unicorn. And people are like, hey, that's great, but I'm not LinkedIn, I'm not Booking.com, I don't have all those resources, and I'm a bank. I can't swap out code like that willy-nilly, right? So in today's presentation, I'm going to do this big example. I think LinkedIn is an amazing example, and then I'm going to give you a much smaller team using way fewer resources that's actually just kind of standing on the shoulders of what these guys figured out a long time ago. So first one is to build for scale. Again, the question yesterday, hey, are there frameworks for doing this? Well, one of the challenges of having each team sort of just find what they like, I mean, it's one thing to be polyglot and be able to use all these different languages, but when it comes to something like a way to roll out stuff and observe it, you want to be able to do something that actually doesn't require a lot of dust and confusion or chaos. And when LinkedIn started, they literally just used the last couple digits of your user ID to decide whether you were in or out of exposed to a new code, right? And they would debate over email for which team could use which numbers in a given period of time, right? Hey, I want to use the 56 through 35s or whatever, right? And they realized that wasn't going to work. So they needed a way to automate that and make it something that would scale out, right? They also, initially, their analysis was manual, was by hand. It was by asking favors from data scientists, right? And that didn't scale. And frankly, it would typically take like 2 weeks if you would do it. And then because it was so much work and because they didn't want to beg so many favors, very often people wouldn't even get the feedback. So there we're back to that feature factory where you're cranking stuff out, but you don't even have the feedback, right? So they realized we've got to automate that. Hello, like continuous delivery, right? We need to automate. So they automated sort of the how's it going part, but it wasn't very accurate and it would flap. So on one day it would say, you're doing great, and you kind of go get your boss the next morning and say, check it out. The thing we did is looking awesome. And you go in and look at the results and now it's flapped to the other side and like, wow, it's doing really poorly. And you're like, wait, this is awful. So they realized that in order for this to scale out and for more teams to use it, it had to be rock solid. And there's another point of this trustworthiness. You don't want to just go cherry pick a number and say, hey, great news. We're heroes. This new thing works. We should do it everywhere. You want something everybody else in your team and in your organization is going to trust and believe, right? And so you need to have something that actually is sort of proven to work over and over again. So it doesn't happen necessarily on the first, the short answer is it doesn't happen on the first try. They had to iterate for months and years to get it right. And then the last thing they came up with, and by the way, this is all advice I got from Yazoo. She spoke at a conference that Split hosted back in 2018, right? And she's been an advisor. If you look, you'll find things in Split that look a little bit like they looked at LinkedIn because people the team from Silicon Valley just kind of disassembles and reassembles, right? So design for every team, not just data scientists. A lot of times we come up with really cool tools and there's like 1 or 2 people in the whole org that understand how to use them, right? If you've got a wizard somewhere, that's a bottleneck. It's not just a bottleneck. It gets back to that trustworthy thing, which is that some people will agree with Bob or Sally or Joe or whoever, and some people won't. But if you have a product, a platform that you've built or that you've acquired that's in your org that everybody uses, that's designed for everybody to get access to, you're way more likely to have consensus and for one team to believe another. So let's switch gears. This is Nathan Wickman from TVNZ, Television New Zealand On Demand. They're kind of like a Netflix. In fact, they're bigger than Netflix in New Zealand. And they have been doing experimentation for a while. And I put here paraphrased by Dave. So these lessons learned aren't right out of his mouth, but they're pretty much what he said. And if you want to know more, you can look at his video or his write-up on our website under split.io/customers-TNVZ. So this is a Split customer, but the feedback isn't really about Split. It's about what it's like to go from doing it manually to doing it in an automated way, right? So they used to assign their users by doing a query. They would have the database people, an analyst, build up a list, say, we want people who've been on the platform for at least 120 days, and we want, this age range, and people who are prone to watching dramas, whatever, right? And because we want to try this new way of presenting dramas and see if people will like it. It would take a while to get that list, but then the list was static, right? The list would be drawn from a theoretical list of who might arrive. right? And the problem was that then they'd have the DevOps team configure their in-house feature flag system to switch people that way according to those lists. But the problem was that people wouldn't necessarily show up just because they're on that list, right? So what's been transformative for them is the notion of assigning people to these different experiences on the fly. So randomizing them as they come through the door rather than doing these queries ahead of time. And you can still use extreme targeting if you want to make sure there are people that do dramas and are a certain age range. That can be in the rules, but then within that, you split those people randomly in two different directions, right? So, and then the last thing was don't analyze by hand. And this, frankly, is the biggest challenge. If you love these ideas, when you first go to do this, you're probably going to try to do this by hand. You're probably going to do ad hoc queries. You're probably going to have people looking stuff up and trying to align the data. And the problem was that the data scientists would be busy or not busy, and so it would take a few days or a few weeks or longer than that to get back the results. They would try something out and they want to know how to go, and the problem is they would have to wait, and so they're kind of sitting on their hands, and it was really a buzzkill from a cadence perspective, right? And now what they do is that because the data is coming in as soon as they sort of open the gates, they've got data whenever they want it, and if let's say they're being very disciplined on an experiment, they're sort of at the top of that pyramid, they're trying to prove something very different is going to work, right? They need to wait about 2 weeks in their case, right? They get to the end of 2 weeks and they have their answer. They don't wait another 2 weeks or 4 weeks to know whether it went well or not. They know right then, right? And so they can immediately iterate on what they learned or roll something out, et cetera, right? So hopefully that's an example of a really big team, a really small team. Last thing I want to do before we go to the Q&A is just kind of break this down into some transferable information you can take to wherever. If you're in a company that likes to build your own stuff, this is kind of a recipe, right? These pieces will let you be discerning about, if we're going to do this, what do we need to do in order for this really to work? And if you're a smaller team and you're looking to actually just go shopping for something or look at different frameworks or whatever, these will help you kind of stay focused on how do you get to that functional pyramid, right? So the first thing is, we talked about this already, decouple, deploy from release. And a lot of you have already accomplished this if you're using feature flags, right? So you need to be able to allow changes of exposure without a new deploy or rollback. Some of you who said you're using feature flags may actually be doing things like build flags or config files in a server. And these things require at least a restart, right? What if I want to be in a situation where I can change this control on the fly without a deploy or rollback, changes to the network routing, et cetera, right? And then in order to actually kind of up your game, you don't want to just have this be like a flat on or off for everybody. Remember, progressive delivery is about doing a bit at a time. And while a canary release, you could sort of route some of your traffic through the release. To actually have real control and learn faster, you want to be able to target by who the user is, whether they're on a whitelist or not, by attributes of them. Are they in a particular population or not? Have they been with you a certain amount of time, whatever. And then random hash on the end of this list. This again gets back to the upper areas of that pyramid. If you want to actually prove something isn't random dumb luck or isn't based on your bias for how you chose your users. Capability number 2, we talked about like being able to just control it, but then you really want to be able to have an automated and reliable and consistent way to answer who have we exposed this to, right? To do the other things, you need to be able to figure out, well, who saw which version or who do we serve which backend algorithm, right? So recording who hit a flag, which way they were sent and why, basically who went which way and why. And the reason we do this is to confirm that our assumptions about the targeting is working like we intended. Like if our goal is to split people up 60-40 or 10-90 or whatever, is it working like we intended? And then finally, confirm that the traffic levels are reached. Like, you know how many people are going to come to your homepage or the top level of your app or whatever. But when you're talking about some feature that's way down in the sort of hierarchy of your app, there may not be as many people going there as you would typically think. And so you want to be able to figure out, are we really getting enough traffic to prove to learn something here, right? And then the third capability is have a reliable and consistent way to answer how it's going. Remember, LinkedIn did choose to automate how's it going, but it took them a while to get it working right before they could actually really trust it. So you want to be able to focus on two things, really. One is sort of how's it going for us? That's the system health things, like are there errors, latency, et cetera. And how's it going for the users? Are the users doing more of what you want, right? So having the ability to compare between the people who got this feature and didn't get this feature, did their behavior change, right? For the better or for the worse? And then really important, and maybe this should have been the first bullet, which is make it easy to include guardrail metrics in comparisons
to avoid the local optimization trap. And one of the questions we got yesterday was, well, how do we get all this data? And do I have to make my developers do lots of instrumentation or whatever? And the goal is no. The goal is you already have telemetry. You want to basically figure out what do you already know and how can you align that with your rollouts so that you can just determine, wow, we've rolled this out to 10% of the people and that 10% are getting something different that we always watch. Right? And where it says local optimization trap, as a team, you're trying to move the needle for something maybe. If you're goal-oriented, you're trying to get people to do more of something. But maybe in the process, you didn't optimize for performance, and so you've built a better flow for users, but you forgot to make the flow fast. And so maybe you'll flip it, maybe you'll light up a guardrail metric that says, wow, this version is 3 times slower than what we shipped last week. And so that's, again, a way to avoid the local optimization trap. You shouldn't have to be worried about everything all the time. That's what, again, we don't want to be hyper vigilant and wear ourselves out. That's what guardrails do, is that they help you watch that stuff without you having to lift a finger, frankly. Whoops. And then 2 patterns for you. One is that, so how do I limit the blast radius and make it so that I can ship more often in smaller pieces with less stress, right? You take those foundations and you make sure you know how to ramp in stages. Know that you can expose to the dev team only, sort of testing and production. Know that you can do dog fooding or sipping your own champagne where you let your employees use this before, or maybe some friendly customers, right? And then you start rolling out to the public, right? Monitor at the feature rollout level, not just globally. This isn't about everybody be on guard, we're doing a progressive delivery rollout. This is, how can I monitor that rollout really zoomed in separately, rather than trying to find things in my global graphs, what I call, looking for vivid facts instead of faint signals. And then alert at the team level. So this may, if you're in a build it, you own it environment, this may make sense to you, but rather than having an on-call engineer or someone in a NOC getting an alert, the first people that should get an alert are the people that built the feature and are rolling it out. Maybe they get it at the same time, but the people who are rolling this, who actually built this feature, are the ones that should be alerted that something's going wrong, because they're going to know what they did and probably how to fix it. And then lastly, kill it if there's a lot of degradation detected. The guys at Booking.com literally have this to a science where they can detect really bad stuff inside of a second and shut it off inside of a second. This is kind of rocket science, but literally, let's say you went to a web page and it's just scrambled, it's all messed up. You could refresh that page and they've already turned the buggy feature off that they'd rolled out by the time you refresh it. For those of us who've been through a war room, instead of an hour, 4 hours, or a day, think of 5 minutes, and you get a sense of why you don't even have to call a war room in the first place, or it's a much shorter, smaller one, if you have the ability to kill when degradation is detected. And then the other thing is, what's really cool is that it's rare that on a particular deployment, we're only really pushing one change, right? Likely you're pushing several things, maybe many, right? If you have a large team, maybe you've got multiple teams doing, there's a lot of stuff going on. Rather than call off a deployment because you found a bug, to be able to continue to ramp up the stuff that's not buggy and just shut off the stuff that is. That's one of the key differences with feature flags, is that you can be selective, right? You can say, here's a crazy story. So LinkedIn, they had a feature they rolled out for recommendation, and they had a little problem, which is they got an email from Reed Hastings at Netflix that said he was really kind of bummed that it was recommending that he should try to find a job as an executive assistant. So the algorithm looked at him being a CEO and said, oh, you work around CEOs, you should consider being an executive assistant, and here's some jobs, right? And so Reed Hastings contacted the head of LinkedIn, and that kind of flowed down, and they're like, oh man, well, instead of killing that entire thing, they literally just changed the targeting so that people in C-suites didn't get subjected to that algorithm. It's pretty cool, right? And they were able to turn off in minutes. Like 20 minutes later, they got back to Reed Hastings and said, try now, sorry about that. Not, oh, we'll try to fix it next week. So, and then the other pattern I want to cover, and then we'll go to the Q&A, is focus, being able to focus your cycles on what works and get that sort of dopamine feedback of, wow, we did it, we nailed that we actually did this. Kind of requires that you take more of this experimentation approach, right? Whether you're at the middle of that pyramid or the top, you want to be able to think more like a scientist in terms of how you gather the data and what you do with it. So you want to be able to target a specific subset of users, but then within that, you want to have randomization, and you want that randomization to be deterministic. And by that, I mean sticky. So if you're saying Dave goes this way and Bob goes that way, when Dave comes back an hour later, he better go that same way he went, because you don't want him to be confused by this changing experience. So having the ability to randomize in a way that is predictable, so that when they come back the next time for that same feature, that same user gets that same experience. And for those of you that are listening to that, think about the inputs. It's a particular user, it's a particular feature. You put those into a hashing algorithm, and as long as it's a good hashing algorithm, you'll get the same result. And what we do is, in our shop, is we do a mod 100, and that gives you a bucket between 0 and 99. And they're always going to be in the same bucket for that same feature flag and that same user ID, or whatever their unique identifier is. And then this other one is kind of a discipline thing, which is don't go looking for evidence after you've done something. If you really want to be disciplined, you should decide what you're hoping to influence by rolling out this feature. Choose that before you start rolling out the feature. Because human beings, as we are, we will go looking for what we want to see, right? But if you decide ahead of time what I'm looking for, you can do spelunking later to figure out what else happened. But to basically choose your metrics ahead of time, you're much more likely to get feedback that's useful, not just happy. And then the last thing is, if you see a little bit of good data, don't freak out. If you have good data or bad data, don't freak out when the first few data points come through. It's more powerful if you can actually make sure there's enough data points to rule out randomness, right? Because random will get you, users behave like users do, but if you have a lot of users, you're going to get statistical significance, and that's a better way to proclaim what works. And then finally, if you're going to do this, make sure that it's not just built for data scientists. This should not be a tool that one or two wizards use. It should be something that every team has access to, that every team can use. So last thing I'll say, and this is a slide I use in most of my talks as well, it's a lot more fun to do what you do when you're good at it, when you've figured out a way to actually kind of hit it more often than not, right? And so, just the reason I share these ideas is that I don't believe anyone should be like on a death march to a certain, I used to work on projects where we'd go for 6 months and we'd put it on a shelf. And yeah, we all got paid and we got some fancy dinners because we stayed late and everything, but it's not fun to actually spend 6 months of your life building something that never really goes anywhere, right? So that's really what's the idea behind all these ideas. This is a link to a whole big long list of stuff I put together when I spoke at DeliveryConf back in January. On progressive delivery. So how do I explain this to other people? Is there a short video I can share with people? Are there some blogs, other talks that I've given? So snap this with your camera or type in that URL, and it's just a big long page. I'm not expecting you to read it all and do, but it's a kind of a smorgasbord of goodies that you can take, because we have kind of a limited time to hang out today.